So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sarah, co-founder and CEO of Infyos. So very close to the pronunciation. And we're on a mission to build a future where every battery supply chain is sustainable. As we all know, the clean energy and clean mobility revolution means battery demand is about to explode. And so we would think right now that battery makers and car makers should be pretty happy. But they've got a big problem. Their battery supply chains are global, complex, opaque, and they're simply not ready. So when a problem does arise in their supply chain, it's already too late and the consequences are often huge. You see Tesla and other tech giants being taken to court for the death of children at mines in the DRC. And then when we look further down the horizon, we see up to an 80% shortage of key battery materials by 2030. Which means that supply chain executives are now putting supply chain resilience as a #1 priority. And so car makers and regulators are now demanding supply chain sustainability in order to make sales. And so supply chain is getting to a point where it will make or break the success of a battery maker. Infyos is a one-stop solution that helps battery supply chain players such as battery makers, car makers, and energy infrastructure companies manage, measure, and improve their supply chain sustainability. How exactly do we do this? Well, we help them by helping them across the entire sustainability journey. They can view their key sustainability impacts across their supply chain, build a tailored strategy to address these impacts, then go from strategy to implementation with the tools they need to manage their impacts and engage their suppliers on the journey with them. How are we already making this happen? Well, we validated the problem and our solution with over 100 supply chain players and are actively engaging with over 15 battery players. We've got key strategic partners and advisors on board. And at the beginning of this year, we closed our angel round backed by Carbon 13 and Fast Track Malmo Accelerator programs. We signed our customer contract a couple of months ago, and they're paying £72,000 per year for access to the platform, with revenue that scales as their production also scales. We launched our MVP at the beginning of this year and are launching our platform this month, and then about to open up for a £1 million fundraise in order to scale out the team, in order to scale out the platform across other customers in the battery supply chain space. Why exactly are we doing this? Well, myself and my co-founder, Tony, have expertise in building supply chains, building the technology for supply chains, and in the battery industry. I previously built the China and Asia expansion at Everledger, the supply chain traceability scale-up. I've been part of the World Economic Forum's Global Battery Alliance and their greenhouse gas working group. And I'm fluent in Chinese and have worked in China, where the majority of the world's battery supply chain players are based. As for my co-founder, Tony, he has a background in supply chain tech and software, and he was previously co-founder and CTO at Packed Coffee, where he scaled them from 0 all the way to Series A and 4 million ARR. We've also got some amazing advisors on board, including Rob, who's ex-head of supply chain at Jaguar Land Rover, and Oyvind, who's a serial entrepreneur in the B2B SaaS world. We're starting with high growth European battery players, but our ambitions are much bigger than that. And due to the overlap in supply chains and the materials, it means that we'll naturally be able to scale into new industries. The market that we're playing in is big and unsurprisingly is growing very quickly. It's already worth over £500 billion and will be worth £1.5 trillion by the end of the decade. We grow as our customers grow, and our revenue model is based on charging them a monthly platform subscription fee depending on their production scale. So kind of back to the beginning, for us, we see that we're still at the beginning of this journey towards clean technology. And at Infyos, we believe you still have a choice about how we can do it, and we want to do it better. So we invite you to join us on this journey to build a future where every battery supply chain is sustainable.
And you nailed the pitch. 23 seconds to go. It's a full shot clock in the NBA, I think. Thanks for sharing what you guys are doing, Sarah. It's incredibly interesting. Let me bring back our other panelists here, Fabian, Alex, and we'll open up some questions for Sarah and Infyos.
Sure, I'm glad that we met today, because I know your deal is in our pipeline, or your response. I think you've been sending us your pitch deck, so great that you presented today. Really cool what you guys are doing. Maybe you can help me to understand a little bit better what's on the platform, and what the desired end product looks like, and also the part on building a strategy, like how you do this together with, for example, a battery producer or a car manufacturer, whoever your client is.
Yeah. Good question. So as I was kind of explaining, the platform split into 4 main buckets at the moment. The first one is supply chain analysis. So you as a battery maker right now, their kind of big challenge is they're high growth battery makers. They're entering into this very competitive dynamics where for the last 10 years, Asian players have dominated the market. They have huge production scales, huge teams, and the high growth players are coming into this market. They're having to kind of position themselves in a different way to how current kind of incumbents are. Firstly, because they need to kind of enter and have a competitive edge. Secondly, because they don't have the economies of scale that their competitors have, and therefore need to find a way to justify the price premium. And then they have some of the most progressive sustainability regulation coming into place. That means that they have to make sure that they're in a leading position in sustainability, simply in order for car makers to have a conversation about, will we buy these batteries or not? And so in terms of how that then relates to the product is, the first thing that they need is to understand baseline, where are they right now? Based on the products that they are producing, what does their supply chain look like? And what are the key sustainability impacts across their supply chain, from renewable energy or energy and carbon emissions to climate risk to responsible sourcing, circularity, and so on. And so the first aspect, which is the supply chain analysis, helps them to identify what are the key sustainability impacts in their supply chain, but also to identifies for them what are your key drivers across investor demands, regulation, and customer demands. That then feeds into the second part, the strategy implementation, which is, okay, if you take a kind of a battery maker right now, they're trying to sell to BMW. BMW has a net zero 2040 supply chain goal, say, and therefore you as a battery maker at a minimum need to have this as your supply chain, your long-term supply chain goal. And so the strategy side helps you to set those long-term goals based on the supply chain analysis, and then also go from long-term, where do you want to go, to, okay, short-term, where are you right now? Right now, you're not even measuring your company carbon emissions. Therefore, the first thing you need to do is that. And therefore, that's where it then feeds into the third aspect, which is the impact management, which is giving you the tools you need and integrating with the tools that you need in order to actually be able to then go about implementing the strategy. And then the final aspect is onboarding your suppliers onto the platform as well to capture the sustainability information directly from them, which then helps to feed into the analysis and into the strategy and the tools over time.
Got it. And how much, or how do you tailor this advice or these insights to every client? Like, I want to get a feeling of how much consulting work it is versus automatable it all is.
Yeah. It's a question we get asked a lot. So there's actually a relatively small variation in types of batteries. And therefore the types of batteries, and also relatively small variation in the number of the different suppliers of these materials and the type of material inputs. And that means that there's a huge kind of automation capability within it to be able to effectively, there's only so many car makers that these battery makers are selling to, therefore there's only so many different sustainability requirements and so on. And so, like, intentionally in the early days, we are working very closely with this customer and haven't spent a ton of money on automation, but we've built it with the processes in mind where we can automate it all, and also kind of layer in additional services. For example, management consultants are speaking to us about how can they use this platform to make the boring parts of their job much easier, and then do the kind of extra work. And from a kind of sustainability perspective, that's great, because right now so much time is spent on kind of data and analysis and actually so much more time needs to get spent on like the strategy and the implementation and the improvement. And so our goal is to really skew the resources towards that rather than the number crunching.
Got it. Maybe one last question before I hand over to my colleagues. On what is your competitive edge? Because I see a lot of companies moving into the space because there's just so much value that you can capture there. So where do you think this is what we do better than anybody else?
Yeah, good question. So I think for us, we see like two main competitor groups. The first right now is, funnily enough, the management consultants. So like right now, when we're speaking to the customer that we've onboarded, their kind of alternative to us was they were going to work with a consultancy on their carbon accounting, a consultancy on climate risk and regulation reporting, another consultancy on their strategy, another consultancy on like broader regulation. And what they were kind of wanting is, how do we make us be able to manage all of this within one place? And so effectively, that is what we're doing, is bringing together all aspects of sustainability and all parts of the journey, from the analysis to the strategy to the implementation, in one place. And then in kind of, I guess, the other group in the market that you see is like niche data or traceability tools, which is, my background is in supply chain traceability. And so that's where you've seen, which is probably what you're referring to, a lot of uptake in kind of like blockchain traceability. And we see that as something that is very much fixing one specific problem of, how do I know where my materials have come from? And how do I know exactly who is in my supply chain? And how do I trace my materials between that? For us, we want to kind of take a step back and say, okay, how do we actually make the supply chain as sustainable as possible? Yes, transparency is one way to get there, but actually, in terms of how to do that as impactfully as possible, it's how do we give enough data in order to understand the key impacts, and then actually go about implementing and improving those on the ground. And so we're kind of much broader than just kind of a data tool or an analytics tool.
Thank you, Sarah.
Cool. Super interesting. And here I have an advantage because I've met Sarah a few times as well. And we've also invested quite a lot into the battery value chain in a few companies that I think you could be working with. But one question that we always see in this supply chain is that it's super complex, and you touched upon it a little bit. Like, how do you actually build enough data and trustworthy data enough to get to the mine where a lot of the impact actually happens, like to get to the workers and also the climate impact that happens at the source of the materials?
Yeah. Really good question. So I would say, like, yeah, totally agree with you on the point that, like, the reason why we have problems with supply chains is that they are complex and opaque. We currently kind of have been for a long time being able to have like an attitude of like, what I don't know doesn't hurt me, and therefore I'm just gonna like continue on with my life and hope for the best. But what you're beginning to see is like regulation is coming in to completely shift that. And on top of that, like just generally like a consumer awareness that supply chains and clean technology isn't quite as clean as we thought it would be. And so in terms of like, how do you address both the complexity of how do you actually get back across to the mine, but also the complexity of just having so many different players in the supply chain? I think the first thing is like doing that effectively. The supply chain analysis is like a materiality analysis of like, what are your biggest impacts and where do you need to focus on first, and making sure that you're focusing on the most high impact things rather than necessarily the things that get the most attention. A great example of that would be like child labor is horrible, gets a lot of attention, but actually when you look at like what are the biggest impacts in the supply chain, there are so many other impacts that also need to have a lot of attention, if not more attention. And so that's where the analysis part comes in to really help the battery makers and car makers prioritize these impacts and say, okay, yes, ultimately we want to get rid of all of these problems, but what are the ones that we're going to work on first? And that's where it comes at both looking at where do you have the highest impacts, but also where do you have the highest ability to influence? And so that's where, for a battery maker, initially, if you're quite small, you're not going to be able to get back to mine and go like deep into solving the child labor problems initially, but you can take part in industry groups that are working on these issues. And therefore, I think that's one of the big things that we've seen as part of this kind of conversation is helping people recognize that even though they can't 100% fix any of these problems, they can at least start to contribute towards positively impacting them and helping them build the pathway for where they are now, given their size, versus, okay, in 5 years' time, this is where the regulation is going to go. This is where you as a company can start to have more and more influence. And also you're going to grow as a company and have a lot more kind of stronger ability to leverage your influence as well.
I think I understand. And my second question on the same theme, with many of these tools where you try to get like data gathering tools throughout supply chains, you need a lot of power from the top to be able to incentivize the suppliers in the supply chain to share their data. And in this supply chain, there are a few like different that are very rare that have a lot of power also for their procurers. Like, how do you incentivize them to go on the platform and actually share their data?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. So that's a large reason why we focused initially on working with high growth European battery makers, is because of what I mentioned around the European regulation coming in, which is battery sustainability regulation, that's kind of the most progressive. On top of that, then kind of like entering into the market, wanting to use sustainability as a unique selling point, justify their price premium and so on, means that they are kind of taking sustainability a lot more seriously. And therefore, they are kind of what we see as like the first movers on pushing sustainability across the supply chain. But because it's being mandated by regulation, we can see that we're also speaking to the larger players that are already beginning to move that. And so our kind of view of it is that there are already enough players who want to improve sustainability. It's just about them finding each other. And so that's where we're starting. And then gradually over time, as the regulation comes in, as pressure comes in more strongly from the kind of the downstream car maker end, you are beginning to already see, in the last few years, how 3 years ago nobody would have talked about transparency, and now it's becoming a thing. And so we're kind of positioning ourselves to be able to ride that wave.
Cool.
One question that I have, everything that you've brought up, and I may have missed this, is backward looking. The supply chain, but the supply chain and the actual battery supply chain has a full life cycle where these batteries are often taken out of use because they no longer are functional for EVs, that the capacity it degrades, but then they go into other applications. And I feel like there's a much bigger climate impact in optimizing that and trying to reduce the number of batteries that need to be produced by repurposing. What are you guys doing on the back end side of the supply chain?
Yeah, really good question. So from the kind of supply chain analysis, taking the holistic view of sustainability, circularity and end of life definitely comes within what we're doing. But I think to kind of balance that out, I think there's a couple of interesting factors going on. Firstly, that like it takes 8 to 10 years for a battery to get to end of life. And so right now we don't actually have a huge number of batteries at end of life. And so in terms of priorities for battery makers and car makers, recycling, end of life, repurposing of batteries is there, but is interestingly not the first thing that they're going to have to move on. And so the way in which our platform works is building out tools and giving them access to the tools as they need it. And so the recycling and end of life aspect of that definitely comes in. And I think the interesting thing that's coming in with regulation is something called a battery passport, where you're going to have to uniquely identify each individual battery. And that will happen at the point of manufacture, but then will also come in helpful at the point of end of life. And our platform supports the battery makers with integrating that to be able to help them on that journey towards making their batteries as circular as possible and having the systems in place that they need in order to do that.
Understood.
I think actually one thing I was just going to say there, that one of the other interesting things is that actually, like, we don't have anywhere near enough of batteries going to ever come to end of life at the moment to be able to feed into the circular supply chain. And therefore, we're still going to have a huge dependency on raw materials. And so that's another big reason why a lot of the focus still needs to be on what's happening upstream in the supply chain.
Understood. And how big can something like this get? Do you ultimately go public? Do you get acquired? You're not supposed to talk about the goals as a startup for your exit is, but what is the actual big picture for Infyos? Where are you guys in 10 years?
Yeah, really good question. So we're starting in batteries because we see that that's like such a big need that is changing so quickly at the moment. And there's a lot of opportunity to get in now whilst the adoption is still relatively small and fix this problem before we have 100% electric vehicles on the road everywhere. But then we're moving from batteries into automotive, given the kind of overlap in materials, into electronics. And then also you see that there's very similar challenges in a lot of other industries, particularly in clean technology like solar and wind. And so the kind of medium to long-term view is to expand across into other clean tech industries and heavy industries that are facing similar challenges.